Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. We're going to go through the book of Joshua, talk about them entering into the Promised Land. This is actually the first book in the Bible considered a historical book. In other words, it's a narrative. It's writing about something that historically has occurred. So we'll see how God brings them into the law in this, into the Promised Land in this book. So the basic overview, we need to connect Deuteronomy to Joshua. Deuteronomy was the last book. It ended with Moses outside the land, climbing the mountain to view the Promised Land, and then to die. It says in Deuteronomy 34, then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. So Moses obviously did not enter in. He had explained how Joshua would take his place as the leader to bring them in. So Moses had commissioned Joshua to do that, take his place and lead Israel into the Promised Land. And in Deuteronomy 31, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua, present yourselves in the tabernacle of meeting that I may inaugurate him, that God may. Then he inaugurated Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them, and I will be with you. Now this is the second time in chapter 31 Moses tells Joshua to be strong and of good courage. If we were to look at verse 7, we would see that. So Joshua begins with the Lord affirming Joshua's commission, really with the same encouragement. Joshua 1:1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun. So God will tell Joshua three times in chapter 1, verses 1, 9, and 18, to be strong and of good courage, something that Moses told him a couple of times, and now God's going to repeat it. It must be difficult for Joshua to fill the shoes of someone like Moses, to take on that position in history with the nation of Israel. Moses was an enormous figure, so just the challenge there, I can understand why God had to continue to tell him, don't worry, I'm with you, just be strong and of good courage. I'll be doing the work. So the basic overview of the book of Joshua will fall into four divisions. The first is the first 5 chapters, where it talks about them entering into the land. The second is conquering the land. That's in chapter 6 through 12. The third is the land is now divided up into the different tribes. We'll take a look at that, chapter 13 through 22. And finally, Joshua's farewell address in chapter 23 and 24. So entering into the land. In chapter 1, God prepares Joshua. We gave a few hints to that. In chapter 2 and 3, there are spies that are sent in. Now they're saved by Rahab, the harlot. Her family lived on the wall of Jericho, and so she hid them to save their lives, and then her and her family were delivered to actually be part of Israel because of that. She's listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, and also she is in the genealogy of Christ. Quite interesting. What that tells us is that anybody in the land of Canaan that had been warned, really, and had known for 600 years, really, since Abraham, that Abraham had a God, his God was the God, that God was going to be bringing these people into the land of Canaan. So by the time Israel got there, Rahab was very familiar with who Israel was. She said, we have heard. I'm sure that people throughout the land have heard. And then she wanted to put her faith in the God of Israel. So if she could do it, being the worst representative in a sense of the land, being a harlot to pagan people that practiced filthy practices, then certainly Anybody in that land could have responded by faith. But she's certainly the representative there. She responds, and then, like I say, she ends up in the genealogy of Christ. Chapter 4 is crossing the Jordan and setting up memorials. They do that in that chapter. We see that they cross to Gilgal. So chapter 5, the reproach of Egypt is rolled away, where the adult males are now, or actually all the males, but the adults that need to now go into battle, they are circumcised before this battle. Not the best military strategy, but this does put them in covenant relationship with God under the law. And the manna stops, no more miraculous food. Joshua is met by the captain of the Lord's army, who is the real military commander in chapter 5, the pre-incarnate Christ. And then Joshua asks him, he sees him with a drawn sword. He said, "Are you for us or them?" And he said, "Neither. As captain of the Lord's host, I have now come." Basically, you need to side with me. So Joshua basically took his shoes off because he realized he was on holy ground, and he bowed down to him. So they're at Gilgal at this point. And so from here, they are now going to conquer the land. So in chapter 6, we have they conquer Jericho. So they move from Gilgal to Jericho. As you can see the arrow there, it's just in a little bit more. And in chapter 7 and 8, then they move to Ai. Now Ai, though they conquered Jericho, and we'll get into that in a little bit of detail in a bit, but they moved to Ai, and they failed at first, and then Joshua discovered from God that there was sin in the camp. The nation of Israel had sin that Achan had committed. He had actually taken something from Jericho that he shouldn't have. Everything was devoted to God from the Battle of Jericho. Jericho was the first fruits of the land. Everything was to be destroyed. But Achan took a Babylonian garment, buried it in his tent, and because his family did not disclose it, we would see that back in Deuteronomy 13, they suffered the same penalty as Achan, and they were stoned. So that's chapter 7 and 8. Then they eventually do go and conquer Ai after they take care of the sin. And again, the nation of Israel is a large extended family. God deals with them as a whole. So then they move there. And as you can see, Ai is just a little bit more in the land than Jericho. So, chapter 9, we have the deception of the Gibeonites and the problem that they posed to Israel. Now, they actually came from just another town over. As you can see, Gibeon is relatively close to Ai. They put on old clothes, took moldy bread, just looked like they had come from a far country, made a covenant with Joshua and the leaders. Joshua and the leaders looked at what they had, and they said, well, obviously it looks like they've come from a long distance, but they never checked with the Lord. They made a covenant, discovered that they were neighbors, that they were supposed to also go in and destroy them. But God said, no, you made a covenant. You're my people. I stand behind my word. You stand behind the covenant that you made. This is now a problem for you because you're going to have to protect them. We will have a lot of Gibeonites in our lives. The Bible teaches us as believers that we are not to be married to unbelievers. That creates a problem. It's unfair to them as well as being unfair to the Christian. And the easiest way to not be deceived into marriage with somebody that may be trying to deceive you is to not date them. So if you don't want to marry a Gibeonite, you just don't date a Gibeonite. So the Gibeonites are a great example for us, people that will want some of the godly aspects that a Christian has to offer, yet not have the same faith. It doesn't work. Two disparate lives, different directions, everything is different, and it becomes unfair not only to each of the parents, but then to the children. So the Gibeonites were under now, or Joshua actually, and Israel under the obligation to care and protect the Gibeonites, no differently than if a Christian marries a non-Christian and then decides, I guess this really wasn't the right thing to do. Well, you're married and you need to continue to maintain your vows and stay married because you've obligated yourself to that person. It's not extended dating like the world sees. Marriage is marriage. So this is a great lesson for us. And again, all these stories in the Old Testament are highly instructive. So in chapter 10 and 11, there's a war with 5 kings at Gibeon. This is where Joshua has a miraculous long day, which other cultures make mention of, though nobody goes into great detail on it, just the fact that they know that it happened. And so other than further conquests that are revealed in chapter 11, this miraculous long day and this battle with the 5 kings is also in relation to these Gibeonites. They need to save them because the battle goes on in Gibeon and they need to go and rescue these people. And then in chapter 12, we see that Israel's victories are now listed out in everything that they've accomplished in the land up until this point. So let's look at the conquest of Jericho in a little more detail. So this is a model, actually. You slide over here. And I have Vern Peterman of Holy Hills Bible Church in Denver to thank for these models that I got. This picture. So this is a computer model of Jericho, what it would look like at the time of the conquest. So this is a oblique view. You can see how there's a wall that is really put on the outside where there's, we'll see in another picture where there's a barrier down below it. There's a quite steep embankment in a sense. This would make it difficult to put ladders up and try to scale the wall. So this was a city that obviously if God didn't get them in, they were not going to get in. This was to demonstrate to the nation, this victory, that God was going to do their battles. They just needed to walk in victory, walk in the faith and obedience that God was telling them to. So this would be a model of what it's called the lateral view. You're looking straight on. So you have this lower wall on the outside. There's an upper wall for the inside of the city. And then you can see how this outer wall would have a retaining wall under it. That's where it is has the steep embankment. And so you can see the design here. Now this retaining wall and all this mud brick wall, this has actually been discovered archaeologically. So this isn't just a guess. This is what has been dug up. So Israel was supposed to march around 6 days being quiet. They went around once each day, and then the 7th day they were supposed to march around, and then they would all shout, and then when that happened, God brought this wall down. So when the wall fell, it actually filled in the cavity there with that steep embankment, and then basically enabled them to be that rubble for them to effectively run up the wall. Now, who would have been under the wall? Obviously, it would have been the soldiers on the wall. So that would have taken care of the soldiers as it fell down, and then they could walk in to have their victory inside of the city, because by the time they had gone around for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, I'm sure the majority of the military were probably on the wall watching to see if they were going to make any moves. And then finally, when the wall did fall down, it would have taken care of the majority of them. Now, I know that people struggle with the fact that God was using Israel to exterminate the people, and I know that's a strong word, but the reality is that he was using Israel as a means of capital punishment to these people that had been warned in the land for at least 600 years, basically to repent and to get away from their false worship. Now, their paganism was not harmless. Their paganism was involved with child sacrifice. There was filthy and perverted sexual practices in relation to their paganism. In the archaeological digs, they've discovered that many of these cities were basically dying of venereal diseases related to their pagan practices. They didn't have the medicines that we have today, and so this is why Joshua had the command to basically wipe out people within the land. Now, obviously, every single solitary person was not wiped out. They basically took over the land little by little as they were moving city to city. There were still pockets of resistance, and we'll see that when we get to the book of Judges. So this Dr. Bryant Wood, he was at the Jericho excavation. He's the one that actually did a lot of the excavating work that enabled us to have these discoveries. And as you can see, he's at the top of that retaining wall. That mud brick wall was removed from. So really interesting stuff, but just a little bit of archaeology for us. And then you can see again the retaining wall there. That's the actual piece of the wall that has been uncovered. So as we move along in chapter 13 to 22, the land is divided up. So in chapter 13, God tells Joshua how to divide up the land. He explains who is going to get what. In chapter 14, Caleb gets his portion in Hebron. Now, Caleb had requested that from Moses, and Caleb reminded Joshua, that's my area. I want it. Moses said I could have it. And there were giants in that area, but Caleb was up for the fight. In chapter 15, Judah gets their portion, and again as the head tribe. 16 and 17, we have Manasseh and Ephraim, which is really Joseph's portion, being his children. Ephraim would become one of the dominant tribes because of their size. Chapter 18 and 19, the land is divided up by lot to the 7 remaining tribes, Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh stayed, remember, on the east side of the Jordan. They did not enter in, though they did enter in to help them fight and then went back home. So Israel's victories are listed out, and then we see that this little map basically shows us Reuben, Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh, on the eastern side, and then the other tribes, how they fell out in their allotment on the western side or inside the land of Canaan. Chapter 20, we have the cities of refuge. These were 6 cities that were designed for a person, if they committed manslaughter, if they accidentally killed somebody, they needed a place to go to be safe. They could get to a city of refuge, and then they would have to remain there for safety. People could not take vengeance upon them for any reason, as long as they were actually not guilty of premeditated murder, which would be searched out. And then if it was accidental, if it was manslaughter, they would have to remain there until the death of the high priest, and then they were released. So there were 3 cities on the west side. We have Kadesh, that was the first one, Shechem, and then Hebron. Now you notice they're kind of distributed throughout the land so that they could get to one city or another inside the land. There were 3 on the east. We had Bezer down south, Ramoth in Gad in the middle, and then up top in Golan we had the 3rd one. So that would be up in the area of where the half-tribe Manasseh was settled. And those would be all on the east side. Chapter 21, the Levite cities, where they were to dwell. There were 48 cities in all, and then that was listed out in that chapter. And then chapter 22, we find that there is a problematic altar that is built by Reuben and Gad. Now they build this altar really as a for the future generations, so that they felt this will connect us, our kids to the kids that are in the land in the future, so they'll know what's going on. The problem is inside the land, poor communication. They thought they were building an altar to a false god. They're ready to go to war, but it was eventually all worked out. So chapter 23 and 24, Joshua gives a farewell address. In chapter 23, Joshua's last counsel is the consequence going forward if Israel does not obey the law, very similar to Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, letting them know you need to obey the law. You are under this covenant. This covenant requires obedience or you're cursed. If you obey, you will be blessed. So there's a reminder of that. He says in chapter 23, verse 6 and 13, he says, keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, else they shall be snares and traps to you. The people in the land will end up becoming a snare to them, which ended up occurring. Chapter 24, he gives a last challenge to the people in verse 15. Familiar verse, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that is how the book of Joshua ends. So the next book is the book of Judges. Until that time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.